Today we're welcoming Ronald Barba. Ronald, please introduce yourself.
Hey, how's it going? I'm Ronald. I'm currently a senior editor with Chronicle of Higher Education, where I lead the brand studio. Professionally, by trade, I guess I am a content strategist. What that means is kind of open-ended, kind of falls between marketing and design. But I think professionally, I started off as a tech and business reporter for a few years before pivoting in-house into a large tech company, where I was the first marketing hire, brought on as director of content. From there on, I have kind of just had a long career in content strategy, content marketing, product marketing. So I have previously worked at Google. I've worked at this content marketing agency called Animals that works specifically with high growth SaaS startups. And now I'm at the Chronicle.
Awesome. Can you think back to when you first started? And do you have some advice for students who are thinking about getting into this kind of content planning, content creation industry?
Sure. I think the most important thing is be passionate about stories. So whether that is reading about them or telling them, I think that is really key for success within kind of this role and kind of this function. I honestly did not expect myself to go down this route. When I went to undergrad, I studied philosophy, politics. For grad school, I did ed policy and then I dropped out. It was this weird kind of stage in my life where I really didn't know what to do. I had kind of this idea of well, maybe I'll do law school. And I took the LSATs, had LSAT scores, ended up not applying to law schools. Ended up with actually a copywriting job at Groupon. And my title was humor writer. So I was writing comedy for them. But it was just a glorified copywriter. And I think within that role, I got really exposed to, well, how can we connect with that Groupon audience? And at the time, the Groupon audience was really, they really the email marketing, and that Groupon was really pumping out. It was really focused on well, how do we brighten up this person's day of, with you? And on the side of that, I kind of started, there was still a tech publication at the time out in Chicago that was focused on kind of reporting on startups within the Chicago startup scene. And so I started contributing, eventually realized that I loved interviewing people and kind of really understanding what their stories were around how to build a business and kind of what is going on in the Chicago startup scene. And did kind of a slight pivot into journalism where I got an internship at the publication, and I started my career as a tech reporter. And I think as I got more into it, I was really drawn into that storytelling element of how can I best try to tell the story that this person on the other end is really trying to tell me, and how can I, take what they're telling me and transforming that into my own words on paper so that the audience at our publication can better understand kind of these nuances and kind of these emotional things that this person has relayed to me, while also trying to add this value to our reader. And I think if you are trying to end up in some kind of content strategy, content marketing career, I think realize that first and foremost, what you're doing is you are trying to be human, right? And you are trying to tell these very human stories, even though, you are kind of this cog in machine and you are trying to contribute to revenue or whatever it is that you're trying to do. At the end of the day, you're trying to tell a story that connects with your reader, because engagement with that reader is really important. So I think if you want to get into this, just be passionate about being able to tell those stories and kind of read stories on their own.
I love that. Where do you start? Do you start with the idea? Do you start with the audience? Do you start with both? Where's a student or a business owner to start when they're trying to create that content?
I think there's you can go about in different ways, but I think the way I go about it is usually you have like an objective, right? Like a primary objective that you were trying to. So if you are like a business owner and your goal is, I want to try to reach this one specific audience because this specific audience is this is going to be who our customer. So it's understanding like who that audience is first and foremost, and trying to figure out like, well, what are they interested in? And then using that as kind of like, I hate saying North Star, but like using that as your North Star, right? And like kind of using that as your starting point. And having an initial idea for like, okay, well, this is kind of the idea for a story or a story direction that we want to go based on this audience. But knowing that before you jump into it, you don't want to be locked into that idea fully, because as you're doing the research, as you're actively out in the field, engaging with this target audience that you're trying to engage with and learning more about their stories, know that that objective is going to change. It's going to change slightly. It might change drastically based on kind of like what you are actually hearing from that audience that you're trying to engage. Because, you start off with this idea based on kind of like an initial understanding of like, oh, this is what I think this audience is going to get or engage with. But then once you're actually out in the field and engaging with that audience, you realize that like, well, maybe that initial idea isn't 100% complete. It wasn't, fully built out. And now I have to kind of like modify it or change it slightly to make sure that, it fully engages with the things that they do care about based on these conversations and these interactions that I'm actually having now that I'm out here. And that's kind of how I approach my work today, and kind of I think is the best way to approach the work, where it's like you start off with an objective based on kind of these core assumptions that you have about the audience or the reader or your customer that you have, but then like know that it's a learning process. Much like everything in life and much like everything in business, it's like you test and you learn and you kind of really try to figure out like what is the best way to optimize this and to kind of make sure that things are aligned. And I think that's kind of like what my starting point typically looks like and how that builds out.
You mentioned alignment. Can you think of an example that can bring that idea of alignment into focus for our audience?
Sure. Yeah. I think when I was at the agency, there's this constant pressure of alignment, both internally and externally. Because not only are you kind of like working within the agency and trying to figure out, well, kind of, do our objectives and kind of the story direction for this piece of content align with kind of the objectives that we are trying to hit based on what the client has said, right? But then you're also working with like, okay, well, yeah, touching back on that client side part, it's like, how do we align better with client expectations? And I think there are several cases where, a client comes to us with this idea for like, okay, this is the audience that we're trying to hit, and this is kind of the story that we were trying to tell based on kind of these set objectives that we are trying to hit. And so they will come to us with this brief of, this is the subject or topic that we really want to try to write about and to try to cover, because this is kind of what our understanding is of how our audience engages with things. But on the agency side, when we are working with trying to actually execute and create that content, things change, right? And things may fall out of alignment slightly. And because, I think, again, I touched on earlier, like in the process of doing the work, you figure out that, maybe our initial assumptions and interpretations of like what the reader wanted or what the audience wanted is not actually what they want. And so there were several times on the agency side where we learned that like, oh, well, like in the process of researching this particular topic, like we learned that like this reader actually doesn't care about that. But like, how do we take our new learnings, apply that to how we're supposed to approach this content, go back to the client and say like, hey, I know that we had this idea for kind of like how we're trying to reach this reader, but like that no longer applies based on what we found. And so how do we kind of work with those stakeholders to better align our expectations? And I think there were several times where you have to work closely, both internally and externally, to try to figure out, well, like, where is the middle ground here? How can we better align our expectations to make sure that we are hitting our main objective? And I think, that's something that I experience on the agency side, but it's something that, you will experience, whether you are in-house or agency or wherever else, where there is this constant battle of like, how do we better align our expectations and how do we better align the expectations of our objectives, so that we are, hitting those goals and really trying to achieve what we're trying to achieve.
It sounds like you're balancing a lot with each story. There's all these different variables. You mentioned stakeholders, you mentioned agency side, you mentioned, not agency side. As you're balancing all these different interests and stakeholders, you're trying to think of what the best story will be for your audience. Can you talk about some challenges of the story side on creating the best story for your audience and how you go about creating the best story?
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of issues can pop up. And I think a lot of it sometimes is whatever audience that you think you have, sometimes this doesn't turn out to be the right audience. So your team or, your client could come in and say that like, our audience is mid-tier software engineers and Series A startups. But then within the process of it and kind of digging more into, okay, well, what is the product that this company is actually offering? What does the current content look like on their website? What do the analytics tell us in terms of like, well, where are these people actually coming from? Who are these people actually? Oftentimes, honestly, you'll find that like whoever it is that, we or a client is trying to hit isn't the actual audience that they're actually engaging with. And so then you face this challenge of like, do we want to try to go for the audience that we thought that we were trying to engage with, or do we want to go with the audience that we are finding is actually engaging with us? And depending on kind of like which pathway you're trying to go, you either try to build on what's already working, what content is already engaging with this audience that was not initially the audience that you thought you were engaging with, but like that is the audience that is engaging with your content or engaging with your product or engaging with your company. Or do you try to come up with a completely new content strategy of like, well, I know that like based on the data that we've gathered, like this isn't the audience that we're currently engaging, but it is an audience that we want to. So like, how do we build a brand new strategy around trying to either pivot our content, pivot our overall brand strategy or overall marketing strategy so that we are in better alignment with that particular audience that we are trying to hit. And I think that's, I think that's something that you will constantly face.
And so alignment and objectives and audience and all those different variables are an important part of content strategy. What are some other parts of content strategy that as students and business owners put together their strategies for how to create the most engaging content? What are some other things they need to be aware of as they're crafting those content plans and content strategies?
Cross-collaboration and communication, I think, is really essential, and it's really key to kind of how we function in our roles day to day. We don't operate in silos. I mean, I think at times there are organizations or the way kind of various organizations are set up, there is a propensity to operate in silos where either you yourself are an individual content strategist who are just working off on your own, or you are a single department, and the way that kind of internally the system is built up, it doesn't favor cross-collaboration. But I think even with those barriers, there is that need to cross-collaborate. And I think one of the core challenges, I think particularly facing this is that you have to be able to break out of whatever barriers, inherent or otherwise, in order to allow this cross-collaboration. Because one of the core functions of the role and kind of the job, when you get into it, is how do I prove value as a contract? Oftentimes, these roles fall within either like product marketing specifically, or marketing more broadly, sometimes they fall under sales. And so, and I think depending on kind of like the size of the organization, if you are entering a smaller organization, you really have to try to prove the value of your skill set. And the main way to do that is like, how do I try to connect my role and what I do to revenue generation, right? And so in order to do that, you need to cross collaborate with sales. You need to cross collaborate with business development. You need to understand, okay, well, who are our customers? How are we reaching them? How do we engage with them? Because you can't create that content strategy in a silo. You yourself can say that like, oh, based on like my marketing expertise and based on kind of like what I know about this audience or what I know about marketing, this is the strategy that I think we should have. But that strategy is ultimately going to fail if you don't have that cross collaboration element, because you need that insight from sales. You need that insight from customer success. You need that insight from business development. Trying to figure out, how are people actually engaging? Who's buying? Who is kind of like really sold on our product, and how do we better engage with them? And I think that is another core element that I think is so essential, which is that you need to be able to cross collaborate and to work with other departments to try to figure it out. And like even design, like I think if you are a content strategist in it, in the sense of like you are a marketing function content strategist and not a design function content strategist where you're already within the design team, there are areas where, design is so core to kind of really trying to figure out how your audience or reader engages with your content. Because little design changes in kind of how we present content on our website, on kind of everything that we try to present within our product, is also really essential to kind of, how do we get our customer or our target audience to engage with us in our content.
Wow, you hit on a lot of things there that I think are super valuable for everyone listening. How do you build value? First, you reach out to all these different collaborators and you make sure that you have buy-in from them and that you're using their data, right?
That's right.
And that's the core of it. Are there other things that you do to build value in your function?
Sometimes it's also coming up with like, what is another product that my team or I can offer as a content strategist? So if you are, for instance, you're working at a SaaS startup, right? And your product is on, I don't know, let's say something is like a front end development platform that just makes it easier for people. Aside from, trying to figure out a broader strategy for like, how do I better show that I have value in terms of like, how can I better understand, our buyers so that the content that we put out there is valuable to them? But also it's like, what is something that I can provide that is of literal monetary value? So like, is there like a product guide, or is there like a series of like webinars or videos that we could try to like offer as a subscription service? So like literally trying to figure out what is a revenue generating product that I can offer based on the skills that I have, which is I do content, right? And like, what can I do as someone who specializes in content and creates content that can help prove the value that I have? And that is literally to provide something that adds literal monetary value.
So you have all this data coming in, you have all these metrics. How do you know what you're doing is working? Which metrics do you pay attention to? And how do those metrics actually affect the business?
Yeah, I think this is really interesting. I think I have a very, I don't want to say controversial take on this, but I think largely now, based on kind of like where industry and kind of, where content strategists and content marketing falls into play right now within the within the larger industry. We're really trying to fight for our roles, right? And again, we're trying to prove value. And so oftentimes when you look at these metrics that we have is we're looking at performance metrics. And so we're looking largely at, what is the click-through rate for an email campaign that we have, or how many engagements are we getting? How many people are reading? How many people are engaging with us? and kind of overall, how many leads are we generating? And I think that's a big thing. That pressure from our C-suite people are, how many people how many customers or potential customers are really are we engaging with? Um, but I think it's a flawed approach. I think if we focus specifically on just these performance related metrics, we are losing a lot of um, kind of brand value. So um, within this role, as you kind of get into it, there is you look at performance metrics and you look at branding metrics. And I think nowadays, because we are really trying to fight for like, well, how do we stay in our jobs and how do we make sure that like we're not laid off like a lot of our other peers in the industry? It's like, how do I make sure that like what I'm doing is really contributing to revenue generation? Um, but that is skipping out on a whole other half of the puzzle, I think, which is branding. And so, how are my content strategy kind of tactics and things that I'm doing contributing to the overall brand that we are trying to set? And so, um, what does it look like on a brand awareness or a brand loyalty spectrum? How are our readers perceiving us as a brand overall? And I think that branding element is so crucial. And I think it's something that a lot of people within this industry are trying to, at least for now, move away from. Um, at least for smaller companies where, you know, they are tighter in budgets and they don't have the resources to kind of spend on it. But if you are working for like a larger company, like a Google or a Microsoft, your team might have the resources to invest in putting out these brand surveys so that you can able to collect kind of these branding metrics that are so crucial. And um, it helps you to understand kind of how your brand overall is performing with the reader or your audience. So do people even like your brand? And I think that's so core to it, right? And if you're trying to build a business from your brand and your product, people need to know what your brand is, know what your product, know what the products are that you are offering, and people need to have a positive association with your brand. If you're not even measuring that, and you are just constantly trying to go for these performance metrics, and you are seeing that like, oh, nothing's working. Well, maybe part of the reason why things aren't working is because either one, people don't know what your brand is overall, or kind of like what you're offering in the first place, or two, they don't like you. like, and I think that is something that I try to emphasize in kind of the content strategies that I put together is, okay, for this particular piece of content or for these content types or content assets or kind of, campaigns that we're trying to put together, are we going for branding or are we going through performance? Because we come in with different sets of expectations depending on whether we are trying to improve our brand image versus like, okay, well, we need to try to make sure that like this set of tactics that we are putting together is focused on generating leads. I think a lot of times nowadays, we are really steering away from, I think, what is so core, which is like, how do we better improve the brand that we have, or how do we make sure that the brand aligns more closely with our intended audience, with our intended customer? But again, I think if you have that objective of like going after branding, you have to understand, but also you need to make sure that your stakeholders understand that like, if we are going for these branding metrics that we are trying to hit, it's not going to show immediate success in terms of like immediate dollars. It's not going to show, an immediate growth in our customer base. It'll take 6 months. It'll take a year. It might take 2 years from now. And so it's knowing knowing that those expectations need to be set, and making sure that the overall business understands kind of the difference between that. But yeah, I think it's, metrics are important, but I would say don't focus too much on the performance side. I think branding is so crucial to kind of what we do, that there's got to be a way for us to, I don't want to say like go back to those, that foundation, but like don't overlook it. I think it's just so core to our overall success.
So can you speak a little bit about the difference in the strategies that you would employ as a content strategist for something that is more brand oriented versus something that is more, I need leads. I need quantifiable leads for my business because I got to pay some bills, right? So can you talk about and differentiate those different strategies?
Yeah. So there's actually a really interesting topic right now within the space of within my content strategy. Does the content I need to produce need to tell a story, right? Um, and my argument is yes. I think every piece of content regardless of whether you are going for branding or performance metrics, needs to tell a story because that's you're trying to engage your reader, you're trying to engage your customer. But I think the core difference between branding and performance is that if you're working a piece that is focused specifically on branding, you have more freedom to tell that story because what you are trying to do is to really try to improve the credibility of your brand, and you are trying to set the stage for like what your brand really is. You are setting up that foundation for either your current customer or a prospective customer base that you are trying to hit, and really trying to show them like, this is who we are, this is what we stand for, this is what our products are, and this is how we follow the set of values that we are trying to establish. And the best way that you can do that is to try to tell a really compelling story. Versus a performance aligned content where the story doesn't need to matter so much. But I think for my personal content strategy philosophy, again, I think storytelling is just so crucial. But because you are trying to, trying to get leads, right? It's that piece of content needs to have a goal. So what are you trying to tell that reader? What are you trying to teach them? What are you trying to engage them with? And so when you are telling that story, you need to have that in mind of like, ultimately, like I need to make sure that like they sign up for a demo. So how do I do that? How do I best tell the story in a way that helps to engage them and, kind of convince them to sign up for this demo? Well, how can I like tell a story using kind of a walkthrough of like what a demo might look like, or kind of like a specific feature that might be really interesting? How do I tell a story around that? And I think those are the kind of the core differences where it's like in a branding, in a story that in a piece of content that has a branding objective, you have more freedom to tell that story and to really focus more on like, how do I just, make my brand look good?
So the customer journey in one is going to look very different from the customer journey in another in terms of how you, like the customer journey is the same, but how you tell the story of the customer journey when you're focused on branding and awareness versus when you're focused on lead generation. Can you speak a little bit to that and focusing specifically on the customer journey side of the storytelling?
Yeah, I think there are two different subsets that you are trying to hit in either one, right? Because if you are working on a piece of content that is more focused on branding, you are looking at top of funnel readers, right? And you are focused on people who may not know anything about like what you're doing, or like generally, like if you are a to-do list app, your reader might not even know that those things exist. And so it's like, how do I best tell that story to like even just like let them know that like, yeah, we exist, and like here is kind of like, here's the best way to do to-do list or something, right? So it's a more general approach to like, how do I connect with the reader in a way that is already something that they deal with on in their day-to-day lives. Whereas in a performance piece, it is people who may be further down the funnel. So they're middle to bottom funnel, and they have this intent in mind of like, I want to find this tool. I know that this tool already exists, but I want to find a tool that that specifically might have X, Y, or Z different functions that I'm looking for. And so that piece of content is really going to focus more on like, oh, well, our tool offers this kind of function, and so this specific piece is going to be on that. And we're going to talk specifically to those features to make sure that that audience engages with us.
That makes a lot of sense. So features, benefits, this makes me think of that question of what do you emphasize in those stories where you want that lead generation? Are you always focused on, okay, what are the features they're most interested in? What are the benefits to the customer? Are you always focused on building a story around that? Or are there other things that are maybe more important there?
No, I think you're right. I think a good like middle of funnel, bottom of funnel piece of content. I hate using those terms because I feel like they're just so industry and jargony. But I mean that's I would say like so you know I know I said that like you know we talk about the features, but honestly I don't like talking about the features. It's more of like how does this benefit you specifically, right? And so it's like how do I solve a problem for you? Because I actually think it's I think it's a bad piece of content when you're focused specifically on talking about the features because people don't care about that. I mean, they care about the features and they care about like what a product offers, but ultimately at the end of the day, what they care about is like how is it going to improve my life, right? And how is it going to impact me personally? And so the story needs to align more with like, okay, well, here's a feature that we have for a particular product. What are the benefits that that particular feature can offer? What are the specific problems that we can talk to about that specific feature, um, so that we are better connecting with the reader? And I think that is kind of the core kind of focus that we're trying to lean on when we are creating these pieces of content is like, how can I make the reader's life easier? Um, and how do we tell a story around that? And so how do we better empathize with kind of you know the issues that they are facing in the day to day, and tell a story around that while incorporating kind of like the features of our product. And I think that's kind of where it gets a little tricky because you know I think again I think it's a bad piece of content when you're focused specifically on like this product has X, Y, and Z feature.
Tell me more about bad content, because I imagine working in this space, you see bad content and you little alarm bells go off in your head, right? And you're like, oh, they shouldn't have done that. Oh, God, that's a classic faux pas. Can you think of some things that you're looking for, or maybe a checklist that we should of things we should avoid when we're creating content for our clients or ourselves?
Yeah, specifically calling out your own company or product or your brand repeatedly in a piece of content is so terrible. I mean, again, so I you know if you're working if your content strategist is working in a larger corporation, you are probably working alongside a product marketing manager. If you're in a smaller company, you probably work within a product marketing team. And so one of the constant things that you will find yourself in is this situation of like a product marketer or someone who specializes in product marketing is going to want the company name called out throughout the piece, or they're going to want to have like a specific product or product features called out in the piece. That is bad content. That's not what you want. Um, and I think it is this idea that like the content that we're supposed to do is supposed to sell people on a product or sell people on a brand. Like that is inherent to kind of like the nature of our jobs and the rule and kind of like the function of our roles. But if you are explicitly calling those things out, that's being super salesy. And I think that turns a lot of people off. And I think a core principle that I learned while I was at Google was like, we don't want to be salesy, right? We want to lean on the authority of who we are and kind of what we do to let the reader know that we know what we're talking about without having to call out our brand or our product constantly. And so we have to lean on kind of like our own expertise. And we have to try to talk about the product in a way where we're not specifically calling out the features, but we're telling a story about like, here is a customer use case where they use this product, but we're going to talk more about the grander issue that they were facing and kind of how it was solved rather than focusing on like they used X, Y, and Z features to like solve that problem. And I think a bad piece of content really leans on like specifically just constantly calling out your brand and kind of like your product in this piece of content because it turns your reader off. Um, I think it goes back to this, you know, my philosophy of empathy within content, which is like when you yourself read a piece of content and you are seeing, you know, pieces that are telling you that like, oh, Google does this or this Google product does this, you're immediately turned off. I know I am. You know, like I would rather you tell me a story about kind of like how is this technology applied in some unique way rather than you just telling me kind of about your product. Because if I want to read about a product, I can just simply read a product description, or I could just go to a specific product page on your website to learn more about it. Um, but no, I'm here for a story, and I'm here for you to tell me like engage with me in some way. And, yeah,
Make me
I,
feel something, right? I want you to
yeah,
make me feel
yeah,
something for this thing, whatever that thing might be, right?
yeah, exactly.
And how do you go about doing that? How do you go about getting that kind of engagement and looking at the flip side of the good content that actually engages and makes people care about what it is you're telling us?
Yeah, so God, going back to Google again, sorry. I was on with Google when I was at Google, and one of our core philosophies was like, think of yourself as the smart friend in a room who is just really interesting. And so and it's so coming stemming from that principle of like, you don't talk down to your reader. Understand that like the reader is assume that the reader is just as smart as you, or they already know something about your product or kind of what you're doing. And so you don't want to dumb it down necessarily. You want to be on an equal playing field with them, um, while still making it understandable. And so it's coming from a place of empathy and really trying to, whether that's developed empathy of like, let me read more and learn more about the audience I'm trying to engage with and trying to put myself in their shoes, or um, really coming from a place of empathy of like, oh, I'm a human being who works in this field, or I'm a human being who has tried to buy X product or has like looked into trying to solve this problem, and trying to approach it from that end of like, what would make sense, or like, what is this person going to engage with? Or how, like, what would, like, if I were them, like, what would I find interesting or what would I find helpful? I think that is kind of core to how I approach this.
Empathy. Again, it seems like it's always the key. It comes back to empathy, doesn't it?
Yeah.
So we know that artificial intelligence isn't quite there yet in some ways, like empathy, for example. But right now, we have a lot of students and a lot of people who are worried because artificial intelligence and generative AI have made such strides that they're being used more and more for storytelling and in content strategy planning and so many other different dimensions of this business. Can you speak a little bit about the ways that we might use generative AI and the ways that generative AI might not be as helpful?
Artificial intelligence is really tough right now. I think particularly within the field, in this field and kind of like what we're doing at this particular moment in time, I don't think it's necessarily something to completely worry about. I will say that like there's so many developments within the field happening, and they happen so quickly that it's definitely something that we shouldn't avoid, right? Um, and I think like even when I touch on kind of empathy within content and kind of I think how the best kind of content approaches it from a place of empathy, I think even then I think I think GPT-4 has gotten to a place where we can even try to really falsify and mimic a certain level of empathy that is, to me, a little bit concerning. Um, and now we can say that, like, oh, hey, like, approach this piece of content from, I pretend that you have been depressed for like 10 years or something, and like you are coming from like this really like it's really quite amazing, kind of like what it can do now. I think there are a lot of different use cases where we can go into a tool like GPT-4 and, um, you know, come up with initial drafts for pieces of content, or even come up with like an initial like content strategy. Honestly, I've seen folks within the field kind of come up with initial frameworks for what are a good set of tactics that they can use within their kind of departments. But I think, thankfully, um, we're still in a place where kind of whatever those tools kind of turn out are still pretty imperfect, and we still need to sort of offer that human guidance afterwards and kind of um, edit and kind of rework the things that it kind of spits out. Um, but yeah, I don't. It's tough. I think if you were to ask me 3 months ago whether or not, I should be worried about losing kind of like my job or like my prospects to tools like this, I'd probably be saying like, no, like it's just like any other tool. Like it's something that I think overall can benefit us rather than serve as a detriment. But I think nowadays, kind of seeing layoffs in the industry and kind of particularly, I'm seeing kind of like these smaller companies who don't have like these extensive runways, right? And so um, they are, I've had kind of my LinkedIn feed is really a lot of people within the industry, and and you'll see people who are CEOs of smaller companies say that like, yeah, we don't have a marketing team. Like we put everything through GPT-4 and that's kind of like, that's our content. Like the blogs that we create, kind of the product marketing pages that we have, like all of it was created through kind of these AI platforms. And so um, I think there is a greater level of concern nowadays about like, yeah, I mean, it could impact um, kind of where, you know, these careers, my career could go. And um, I think the best way to get ahead of it is to try to adapt now and kind of try to figure out like, how do I, like, where are the areas that I can try to implement the tool to help me improve my job? Um, and try to figure out like, okay, well, if I do use this tool to replace certain functions, are there areas, like new areas that I can try to explore so that I can continue to prove my value within my role? And I think that's kind of where we are right now in this industry of like, people within this role are really trying to figure out how to work alongside it rather than to work against it. Because we do understand that it is core to um, it's core to the development of the industry, but it's core to the development of society overall, right? And it's something that is so inevitable, and it's so something that is and will be continually ingrained within our everyday lives. That um, it's a matter of really trying to figure out how do we work alongside this technology, um, not just within our jobs, but like in our everyday lives, um, to make sure that like we are continuing to kind of do these jobs or kind of evolve. I don't know what does the new generation of content strategists look like?
How do you use generative AI now? How are you putting it into practice, and how are you not putting it into practice?
So I do not in my current role, actually. That's yeah, I think so. I think what's great about my current role is a lot of it is I need to interact with people in real life a lot. So I need to do a lot of interviews and I need to be able to talk to people. And so that's currently not something. So like the nuances of that and kind of the conversations that happen around that, that's not something like GPT-4 can do now. Like I can't tell them to like, hey, pop into this interview and like conduct this interview and like come back to me about like how did they respond to questions or what were their facial expressions like. That's not something that tool can use nowadays. And I think a core part of my job is really these face-to-face interactions that I have with people. And so it's not something that I really use in my everyday. Honestly, I don't think I've like checked it out in a few months, um, just because it's not something that is crucial to kind of how I approach things. It's also not something that like our organization currently kind of really tries to place emphasis on. And I think, which I think is it's a breath of fresh air. And I think a part of me also is like, oh, but I should like, right? It's like I should try to figure out like how can I incorporate this in my day to day. But I think at the moment I find it refreshing that I don't really need to, and there's no pressure for me to do it based on kind of like what my role is like here and kind of like what our values are as an organization. So it's yeah, I mean, I think now that you brought it up in this conversation, now I'm like, oh, I really should. Like, I really should try to figure out like how do I incorporate this um within my role. I know my boss does actually, but um yeah,
Yeah,
it's a good question.
the pressure to use the new tool, right? So it's
Yeah,
that pressure. Oh, here's a new version of this software you have to use to keep up, right? So I'm just thinking in terms of the kinds of business problems that you face, not like the kinds of business problems that you're facing could be helped by putting some of the metrics into the machine and seeing what spits back out with a clever prompt. But that's kind of the extent of what I'm thinking it could be used for someone who is so dependent on the relationships and the conversations that are happening in real time, which you are in your job, right?
Yeah, yeah, that's right. And like even when it comes to the data side, like I think we are in a large enough organization where um I will only the way that our organization is set up, I don't 100% really need to rely on a lot of those metrics. Because I am more focused in my role on like how do I tell the story best without necessarily caring about the metrics too much. It's more of like how do I tell a story that best aligns with kind of our direction as a publication and kind of tells a story in a way that is that aligns with the integrity of kind of the Chronicle, and that's kind of that's my main focus. And so I don't have to necessarily rely on those metrics right now.
That sounds like a luxury, right? Since everyone's
Yeah, oh,
scrambling to
it
figure
is. I
out.
know. I'm definitely cognizant of that, and I think
Yeah,
that's why like I'm glad that you brought it up because I'm like, oh, shoot, like it is
yeah.
something that I should like learn to try to incorporate.
Can you speak a little bit about the challenges you're facing right now at the Chronicle with some of the business goals and the clients and the stakeholders and the specific kinds of problems that you're solving that might give insights to people who might be solving those same problems soon?
I don't think our problems here are unique, really. I think it's the issue of like how do we make sure the stories that we're telling and kind of everything that we're putting out aligns with the expectations of our reader. And I think that is just foundational to the role of a content strategist or anyone who kind of works within the content function within any organization. Um, which is, yeah, how do we make sure that like, I could be telling the best story in the world, but like if that story doesn't vibe with who I'm trying to get to read the story, like it's just sitting there, right? And it's not engaged with anyone. And so that's really kind of I think what I face in my day to day and kind of like what we face as an organization overall. But again, I think it's not unique to any organization. I think it's something that is just kind of innate to our roles. And yeah.
Do you find yourself telling the same kinds of stories more often than not? And if so, what kinds of stories are those?
Yeah, I wouldn't say that we're telling the same kinds of stories. I think we're trying to come up with a new spin of different stories and different narratives, right? Because there's only a number of ways that we can say that like, oh, AI within higher ed is being used, right? And so it's like constantly trying to figure out like, oh, like in our interviews or kind of like in our conversations, like what are other things that we can like home in on? What are the areas that may be untouched so that we are giving this a new spin and really trying to look at it through a fresh lens. And I think that's a difficult issue. I think particularly now because again AI like there are certain topics that are trending that our readers want to read more about, but there's only certain things that the people that we interview or talk to can speak to, or there's just like very little out there to even cover that. We find that there is difficulty there in really trying to figure out, well, what is the new story that we can try to come up with.
So the struggle is sometimes keeping things fresh with new themes, new perspectives, new points of view. And how do you do that? Are you just like brainstorming in a group with a whiteboard all the time trying to say, okay, how can we break apart this thing and make it a new thing? How do you go about solving that problem?
Meetings. It's a lot of meetings with other people and really trying to figure out like, well, okay, well, this is, this professor said this, that was a little off topic and it seems really weird. And like, why are we not talking about this? And how can we try to use them as a source or try to tell a bigger story about this? And really trying to figure out like, we try to keep a sharp eye on kind of like what discussions are happening out there. And so it's really just like people just like scrolling through Twitter and like seeing what's new, or like poking around our sources and trying to figure out like, what's coming up, like what are some new things and new developments, or kind of I don't know, just things that are refreshing.
Yeah. So you're looking at a whole variety of different social media sources, publication sources. Those kinds of sources inform your work.
Oh, 100%. And I think I think again here it's not unique to our organization. I think it's, for anyone within this content function. I think
Hmm.
um tapping into places like LinkedIn or Twitter,
That makes sense.
um Threads. I feel like Threads is dying down now
It's
again,
like
but like, it's like,
it's
really
waves,
trying to
right?
figure it out. Yeah, yeah.
I sources. So sources made me think of another question that I want to be sure to ask. What sources do you recommend for someone trying to get into this line of business? Do you have a book? You have a movie we should watch? You have something that we can dig into for lessons on how to be better at content
Y-
strategy specifically?
Yeah, I think Everything Writes by Anne Handley is a book that I think anyone who is trying to do something within the content function needs to read. I think she does a really good job of kind of walking a person through on what kind of content, or like how to approach content in a way that aligns with the expectations of your reader, regardless of who it is, right? Um, the Superpath community, I'm not sure if like people are already aware of it, but Superpath is this like Slack community that was created by um, a former colleague at Animals, which is the previous agency that I was at. And it is literally just everyone within kind of the content marketing field all in one place. So you have people who are, directors of content at places like Klaviyo or Microsoft Teams to just smaller startups. And that is the big, really active community that is just a very useful resource. It recently, I will say that the Slack group recently pivoted into a paid model, and so right now there are certain channels that are free, but there a lot of the other channels that they have right now are exclusively paid, which I think is really depressing to see, because I think it is a really useful resource. I think anyone who wants to get into this should still join, and then consider making the jump in paid prescription. But like I think that's a really useful thing, and I think the biggest thing is just read stories. Like read Atlantic, Harper's, New Yorker. Uh, or if you're a podcast person, I like Heavyweight from Jonathan Goldstein, which is so it's Gimlet Media. Jonathan Goldstein was previously at This American Life for a really long time. Um, but I think the storytelling he does with that podcast is really fantastic. I can't tell you the number of times I've cried over certain episodes because like that storytelling element is just really there. And I think again, like I really emphasize like good storytelling when whatever content you're doing. Um, and then if you were doing more content strategy on kind of like the design side where you are, working more closely with the UX team, I think the content strategy podcast with Christina Halverson does a really good job. And so what she'll do is she'll interview um, like a content designer, content strategist lead at um, like Slack or something, and talk through about content design principles and how to best engage product users within kind of the content strategy that you're doing.
Awesome. Those sound like really useful and helpful resources. Do you have a framework for storytelling that you go back to, or do you have more than one framework for storytelling that you like to use?
Yeah, definitely. I think it's a great question. I think, going back to kind of like AP English days, kind of so years ago, but like, I think just your universal plot outline, right? Of like exposition, rising action, climax, falling action, then your denouement. And it's like when you kind of read through kind of like the most compelling stories or the best stories that you read, it kind of still follows that basic framework. And I think with any kind of content that you're creating, whether, again, it is something that is tied to the business, I think that is like a loose outline that anyone should be following, because it is um, I think as human beings, we fall into a set level of expectations. And so we find ourselves falling back into this idea of like, well, yeah, like how does my brain interpret what a story looks like? And so I think we are already programmed to understand like, this is the progression of what a story should be. And so we meet those expectations by like going back to those basic principles that we learned, in middle school or high school or whatever. And I think that's kind of how I approach my storytelling. Again, like whether it was when I was, a journalist, and to kind of where I am now, where I'm really more focused on like, well, how do I tell this brand or product story? like that is kind of still kind of the general framework that I use.
So even today, after all these years of telling stories professionally, you're still using that framework for telling stories. Do you have any other little things that you like to sprinkle within, maybe some techniques or strategies that would help uh, storytellers who are new to the game?
Be surprising, like add a surprising element. I think there is, I think if you find yourself in a corporate atmosphere where, your objective is to kind of figure out, how can I make sure this content builds revenue or kind of is business aligned, um, and I had this particular brand voice that I'm trying to follow, right? And um, know that there are opportunities to break away from that brand voice, or I guess to modulate the brand tone in a way that you can incorporate something surprising into the story while still aligning that with your own voice. And so, um, learn to take risks, in the stories that you write. I think there are a lot of times you'll be surprised by kind of like the results that you get from it and kind of the readers that you engage with. Um, I think there are times where you will hit a new audience that you, weren't intending to hit before. And so, um, yeah, I think stray away from kind of initial thoughts or initial plans for kind of what a story may have looked like, and play with it.
Being surprising and taking risks, that sounds like something that might be difficult in a corporate environment or where you have different stakeholders that you're trying to measure things against. Can you talk a little bit about risk taking and build more on that idea of risk taking as a content strategist with so many different audiences and stakeholders to manage?
Yeah, it's I mean, one of the things that you have to, it's buy-in, right? And so you have to get buy-in from people. And if even if you do, God, I give the advice of taking your risk, but at the end of the day, you do need to get buy-in from people. And I think part of that is when you are taking a risk, to make sure that you have a plan to ensure buy-in from a stakeholder. So if you're going to say that, like, I think like if I take this risk on story, I think it's going to pay off, maybe have some data prepared, right? And like maybe try to see, use like anecdotal evidence, like, oh, this like competitor did this story and they like played with it for a bit, and now they've like I've seen like recently that they slightly pivoted to align with that risk that they took. Use that as evidence. So take calculated risks, I would say. Like make sure. Yeah. So yeah. So it's if you want to take a risk, just make sure that you are confident enough and in a place where you can back that up with some kind of support. Because I think, yeah, that is important to have kind of that stakeholder buy-in.
Selling and you mitigate the risk by selling the ideas to your teams and the different people that you're collaborating with.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
getting that buy-in. That sounds like it can be really hard to do to get people on your side. Do you have any tips for people who are struggling to get buy-in from their marketing chief or their CFO or whoever it is that's holding them back from taking that final risk?
Yeah, so I think this is something that I do personally that I've kind of like learned to do in my career is whenever I enter a new job or a new organization, um, my first few months are really focused on relationship building and kind of building my rapport with the people that I think are going to be core stakeholders to whatever projects I'm working on. Um, so basically trying to be friends with people, but like in a very genuine way. I don't mean to like falsify any kind of relationships. That's not the type of person I am. I just have a genuine interest in other people and kind of like understanding who they are. But also within an organization, it's understanding like my place and knowing that like I don't operate on my own, and that I know that it operates as an entire body. I need to figure out who those other people are, that I need to operate with in order to make sure that I'm successful in my role. And so the first few months, I would say really focus on building those relationships, because there will come a point where it's like you want to take that risk, or you want to make you're trying to make these decisions that you think will pay off. But in order to get that buy-in, you need to have established that level of trust. And in order to build up that level of trust, you need to build up that relationship and that like mutual understanding of like respect and communication. Um, and so I think in order before you, kind of get to that point of like even considering these calculated risks, it's really just relationship building for the most part. And really focusing on kind of like, what can I learn about these other people within my organization who are so core to kind of what I'm doing, and how I operate with this job function, so that I have a better understanding of like my role, but I also have a better understanding of who they are, what they look for when, um, what are their expectations for this role that I'm doing, what are their expectations for kind of like anything in this organization, so that like when that point does come when you need to pitch them on an idea that needs their buy-in, you have already met kind of that base level of expectations that that you've learned from them as people, they will come to expect.
Excellent advice for more than just content managers. What are people who don't have that collaborative environment or don't have that team to lean on to do? I mean, we have a lot of people out there who are solo podcasters, solo content creators. What advice as a content strategist do you have for those folks who are doing it alone?
Yeah. I think that happens a lot. I think there are a lot of times, like even within, like even if you happen to look out and you are in kind of like a larger team, a lot of times you are often the only person in your role. Um, I think my biggest advice is like to seek out communities that can help support you. And so know that there, I mentioned Superpath before, but like there are communities like Superpath who, they are a community of content strategists who may be facing similar issues, both on the business side, but also on like a personal side. Like, they can also share their experiences of like, hey, I am a single content strategist. I may be the only person within the product marketing team, or I may be the only person within the marketing team within an organization. How do you face this? I myself have am part of my own communities of that I lean on, people who are also kind of within this field that I turn to when I have issues. So it's like if I'm facing a very particular content marketing issue that I like need help solving, when there's no one in this organization that I can turn to, I know that I can turn to them and ask them that question and kind of get their support and kind of their feedback. It is really important to have people alongside you and kind of supporting you, both like to help you get through your jobs, but also just like for your own mental health, right? And it's like it can feel super lonely, because I think a lot of times, particularly in smaller organizations where oftentimes, C-suite doesn't fully understand kind of like the hardships that you're facing or kind of the challenges that are unique to the problems that you were trying to solve. And they don't have, they might be coming with that background, so they might not really understand kind of the issues that you're facing. It's important to have a community of people that you can turn to who just gets it and kind of can really empathize with you, and not just empathize, but like be compassionate. And I think that compassion is so crucial to kind of our survival within this field, but also just survival as human beings. And like we need people to we need people to surround us with and act as our support network.
Love that. I wonder, as you're a member of these kinds of content strategy communities, are there things that you see popping up? Are there themes maybe in the struggles? Are there some similarities in the themes of the struggles of content strategists that you see in these communities?
Yeah, I mean, I've brought them up before, and I think the main thing is like getting buy-in. I think it's particularly tough. It's you know, it, especially within kind of if you are a part of these smaller startup companies, organizations. Again, like your C-suite might not understand like that you can't just grow your audience 10 by 10 times in a month, right? Like that's not going to happen. There's no way in how that's going to happen. And they're not going to understand that. And nobody may understand in the organization. I think that is a reoccurring theme that ends up happening of like, help. Like, how do I get my CEO or CMO to try to, to tell them that, like, that goal is not going to happen, that we're not going to reach that by then. Um, and so how do I prove that? How do I prove that in the numbers? How do I prove that in kind of, through competitive research or analysis, or kind of like an overall industry analysis of like what's going on in the field? Like, what are ways for me to kind of tackle that head on, so that like I can keep my job? And I think that is really, I feel like that's like the biggest thing that content strategists face. I think, again, now, particularly where we are in our industry, where it's like, um, organizations see content as like much lower within that prioritization of marketing needs. Um, and they can turn to a tool like, ChatGPT to kind of create little content assets. Um, it's, how do I try to convince them that, like, whatever ideas that they have or objectives that they have may not work? And how do I get buy-in on a completely new strategy that I think better aligns with, um, our expectations as an organization?
And on the flip side, the wins that I'm sure are shared in that community. Do you have a win that you might have shared in that community or might want to share with our audience in terms of, I had this problem and I overcame it in content strategy?
Yeah, I think anytime that, like, any piece of content or any campaign outperforms my initial expectations, is a huge win. Um, I think, in particular, when you are competing for, if you're competing for an audience that is super hyper engaged online and already have all these different kind of channels that they are already looking at and various different stories they're already reading, when you see a story of yours pop up and it is outperforming kind of your initial expectations, where that audience who is already hyper online and is already has focused their attentions elsewhere, that's a huge win. And it's like, you take that to your community and be like, look at this. This is amazing. Um, can you help me try to figure out why we did so well? Like, why did this perform so well? Like, please help. I really am interested to know, because it's like, um, and it's good to have that feedback of like, oh, well, maybe the story was like just, you know, um, really well done, and like, or there was something just very specific to kind of the way the story was told, or something, a unique thing within the story itself that like really engaged the audience. But yeah, I think those kinds of wins
I,
are
wi-
really
I,
great to share.
I'm wishing there were consistent answers now so we could have a checklist of what makes wins, what makes something.
Yeah.
Is it the headline? Check. Is it the empathy and the emotion? Check. Is it the logic? What is it? What are those things that give us those wins? But of course, if it was that simple, we'd all be out of a job, right? Do you have a checklist in your head to say, this is going to be great content? I know it has a better chance of hitting and getting that W than not.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's God, I wish. I mean, I do, but I don't. Right? It's like, I think at my last job, um, our director really did a really good job of putting together an actual checklist of like, this is what makes for like a good performing piece of content. You have a really great header, an on-page SEO checklist of like, this is what's happening. This is how we make sure that like that this content is discoverable by kind of like the web crawlers and stuff. And kind of, this is kind of, is our thesis intact? Like, do we have a really good standout thesis? Are we really hitting them on the nail of like, this is kind of the message that we are delivering? But even then, like, it's kind of, even with a set checklist, it's like, you never know when a piece of content is going to perform well. So like, you can check off all those boxes on a list, and that you've like come up with that, based on kind of like historical data that you've shown, like, these are the kind of pieces that do well. But even then, like, that's not going to guarantee success for a piece of content. I think that's another kind of like risky part about our job, is that like, you can come up with a set of standards, and you can create systems that like supposedly guarantee success, but like at the end of the day, like they don't, right? And it's you never know what our audience wants. You never fully understand kind of like what the algorithms want. You never, there's just everything is constantly changing, and so you can't really always guarantee any kind of content success, regardless of whatever standards that you've kind of set.
I could hear that lone TikTok creator or that lone podcaster or that, that person who's struggling out there in the wilderness who has their checklist agreeing with you vocally right now to say, yes, I have my checklist, and it's still very difficult to break through the noise, right?
Yeah, because there's a lot of noise out there, right? It's like, that's especially with like, we are constantly facing this influx of like new media channels and new kind of media to consume, and so with that comes this like new ways of content creators and content producers, and we're all trying to fight for people's attention, and that's hard when like our attention is all over the place, and so again, like even if you have like this perfect set of like, I have this like recipe for success, like, that recipe may not be great. Like it's, your, I don't know, your oven's at a higher elevation. So like the recipe's F, unless, like I don't know what to tell you. Yeah.
That's a great metaphor. I like that elevation thing. I just got back from Colorado, so it's speaking to me. I'm like, oh yeah, my elevation, like I got to cook it a little bit longer. Because I think that's so true. And that's one of the things that makes it such a difficult business to be in, is that, that rush of getting a win feels awful good. But when it doesn't, you really have to stay strong. How do you stay strong? What do you do whenever you don't have a hit?
I don't know. Do I stay strong? You don't know. I could be breaking down every day. You have no idea. No, I think I'm in a really grateful position where I have the support of my team and my manager, and so we are aligned oftentimes with very many things. And so when things don't perform as highly as we think they might, or I may f up somewhere, we are in a place of mutual understanding and respect now, to a point where like I don't, I don't break down when something fails. I kind of just go on to the next thing and kind of try to figure out, what did I learn from that, and how do I apply those learnings to what I'm working on next. And I think that's kind of the mindset that we approach in order for us to succeed in these roles, is like, you're gonna fuck up, right? And it's like, we're gonna make mistakes. And I think, there is a we talk about, that old proverb of like, make mistakes, learn from it, or whatever, right? And I think as long as we're making mistakes and learning from them, that is something that we can learn from. I think the issue comes in when we're constantly making mistakes and it turns into behavior and a learned behavior. And then that's kind of like a problem that there's something wrong that you kind of there's something bigger that you need to tackle, right? There's a reason why we're making the same mistakes or something, but like, as long as we're making mistakes and learning from them and then kind of applying learnings to kind of whatever we're doing next, I think having that mindset and understand that like I can improve from this is really crucial to kind of sustaining ourselves in the jobs that we do.
I think that's a beautiful sentiment for sure. Is there a specific mistake that comes to mind whenever you think about that process? Do you have a specific maybe story of a mistake and how you grew from it?
Oh man. Yeah, a few years ago, so when I pivoted out of tech journalism, I took on a role as a director of content for healthcare.com, which was this healthcare startup, which is like now worth like more than 1 billion or something. And I was the organization's first marketing hire. And that company moved quickly. It moved really quick. It was very, we were aggressive and we were very performance driven. And I made a lot of mistakes there. And I think the core mistake that I made was like, um, I failed to set the proper level of communication and collaboration levels, particularly with my boss. So I reported to my CEO at the time, um, and I think that main mistake is kind of what led me to kind of develop from that and learn that, like, oh, communication is so crucial to my job, and like collaborating with all these various departments, and like making sure that like my manager is like fully aware of kind of like all the initiatives that we're doing, and kind of like working alongside them rather than like just reporting them directly or like following whatever orders that they're trying to tell you. um I think that mistake is just so crucial to kind of like um the trajectory of the rest of my career, whereas like after that I just truly learned to be more trusting of my direct manager and the teams that I worked with, to where now I am really focused on that collaboration element and making sure that I am communicating constantly and frequently to align expectations across departments and across our stakeholders.
I I know it's very difficult to communicate value, and not only you have to recognize the value, but you have to communicate the value. Do you have any tips for communicating value to those stakeholders?
Yeah, I mean, that's I think this goes back to kind of our point of like, well, I want to show them more than performance metrics, and I want to show them branding metrics, and um, kind of coming to them with hard numbers and like, this is the data that I'm seeing, and kind of what we're seeing in terms of the initiatives that we're doing, and kind of the campaigns that we're running, um, but then also kind of moving away from the very hard metrics, and then also seeing kind of like, oh, well, like these are the conversations that we are seeing loosely on like social media around our company, that weren't happening before, or um, and that is kind of showing the value that we have as an organization, kind of the broader value of kind of the efforts that we are doing. But that's also showing, honestly, it's also showing internal value of the work that we're doing. So it is like, oh, like I am teaching my intern this new thing, right? And so this is the kind of value that I am delivering in my role to help develop the skill set of someone who is completely new to the field, or um, this is my value in helping to streamline internal processes. Like without my role, like could X, Y, and Z have been done? Probably, but like it's more efficient now that I'm here. Um, and honestly, that's kind of what I'm doing now, where it's like, well, what could the Chronicle have looked like had I not been like here, right? And where it's like, what is the value that I am adding, and kind of where are the stop gaps that have been solved, or kind of the problem areas that are no longer problems because of kind of whether just the mere existence of my role within the organization, or kind of the new systems that I have created to make sure that various parts of the overall organization function more effectively.
Ronald, can you share your name, title, and where people can find you online?
Sure. I am Ronald Barba. I am a senior editor of the brand studio at the Chronicle of Higher Education. You can find me on LinkedIn. You can still find me on Twitter. I'm inactive there now, but those are really the core two platforms that I'm on.